Dalton Kincaid, Cole Kmet, and TJ Hockenson have all been relied on very heavily by their fantasy owners this season. And entering week 13 with all three of them missing, are you going to have the backup needed in order to fill that position up? Well, if you're looking to scramble here at the last minute, stream somebody, or if you have a couple of different tight ends you're trying to choose between, this is exactly the video that you're going to need. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back to the Fantasy Headliners, and I have got my start and sit analysis for every matchup at the tight end position here in week 13. And I will say we've been recording these videos typically Tuesday night heading into Wednesday, and because of that, there aren't a ton of great pick'ems for tight ends on Underdog as of yet. So you know what? I've got a special one for you today. Let's go ahead and get you signed up over on Underdog right now using code word headliner so you can take advantage of it. And Underdog came to us and said, we want to give you a special pick'em promotion this week. Who do you want? Let's go 0.5 yards is the line. And we said, you know what? This guy has been up and down all season long, but let's make it so we can basically hit the over with no issues. So Calvin Ridley at 0.5 receiving yards is going to be the headliner community special this week. If you get signed up over on Underdog using code word headliners and make your first time deposit of at least $10, Underdog is going to match that deposit up to $100, and you're going to get the Calvin Ridley community pick'em, especially for everybody getting signed up with our code word this week. There also may be some other specials that you could use in some different pick'ems as well. So make sure you go get signed up right away. We've had a ton of green in Discord as of recent. If you want to finish the season strong, maybe fantasy wise it hasn't really worked out for you the way that you want to, let's finish the year strong in our pick'ems and turn this thing around here at the end of 2023. Without further ado, let's talk about week 13, Thursday night football, Seattle and Dallas matching up, and there's really only one tight end that we're going to be discussing here. Jake Ferguson's inconsistencies continue to stem from the fact that he's just not getting a consistent, reliable amount of targets. In the games this season where we've seen him approach 7 targets or maybe even more, he's been a fantasy asset and with inside the top 10 easily almost every single week. It's the weeks like last week where Dallas blew out Washington and Jake Ferguson was only able to get 3 targets that is making it hard to trust a consistent performance from him every single week, even though Dallas is playing really well right now. In weeks 8, 9, and 10, Jake Ferguson went 3 straight weeks with a touchdown, and things seem to be headed up. But in the 2 weeks since then, he has 4 receptions for 67 yards. He's just not getting it done right now. But this matchup against Seattle, I'm hoping it stays a little bit closer throughout the entirety of the game. If it does, then I think Jake Ferguson is going to get a little bit more involved in the passing game than what we have seen as of recent, which will definitely help him. The green, I know. I just said he's super inconsistent, but I believe this is a matchup where those 7 targets definitely to come into play once again. And if they do, Jake Ferguson will be just fine. My hope is that Seattle keeps this game neutral for a majority of the evening. And if they can, then Dallas is going to continue to throw the football because that's what they do best right now. And on the outside, Seattle has done a really good job of trying to limit wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb is unstoppable, and I highly doubt we're going to see Devin Witherspoon going back and forth between him too much, so he could be on the outside solely on Brandon Cooks the entire game. And if that happens, and we kind of take that Brandon Cook pressure away, and we move some of those targets over to Jake Ferguson, he could end up having a great day. But the yellow indication on here is just merely on the fact that he just isn't getting the target share through the majority of the season that we need from a top tight end. For the Chargers and the Patriots matchup, the only guy we're keeping an eye on is Gerald Everett. Josh Palmer could return, but at the beginning of the week, Brandon Staley didn't really give us a lot of information on whether or not he thought he would be ready to go. So as of right now, it's very likely that they could be without Josh Palmer again. Keenan Allen still has been banged up a little bit, but his production hasn't been hurt at all. Mike Williams is hurt. Quentin Johnston was hurt last week. It just feels like everybody in Los Angeles right now is having difficulty staying healthy. And with the lack of availability at wide receiver, Gerald Everett could end up seeing a decent target share this week, even though New England's defense is right now allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. Gerald Everett could bring you in 3, 4, 5 points this week based on volume alone. But if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's not going to have a whole lot of upside to offer. And for Hunter Henry, his performance this year has been directly tied to the downfall of the Patriots offense. It looks awful right now. It's surprising that Ramondre Stevenson is actually doing as well as he is, given how poor the quarterback play is and really everyone else around him right now. But Demario Douglas is really the only consistent factor right now as far as pass catching goes, so Hunter Henry doesn't have any value probably for the rest of the year. Sam Laporta has seen a small hit in his volume over the last few weeks because since the bye 3 weeks ago, he hasn't gone over 50 receiving yards, but he's still being looked at in the red zone, scoring a touchdown this past week. And quite honestly, Detroit's turnover issues are really the biggest issue why he probably hasn't seen more targets or receiving yards the last few weeks. If they get that cleaned up, everything will be fine in D-Town, including Sam Laporta's production as he continues to be a super safe top 10 tight end this season. And here's a fun fact about Taysom Hill, a guy a lot of you are probably still trying to start right now. Taysom Hill has scored under 10 fantasy points in all but 3 games this year. He's only been a top 12 tight end 4 times, and one of those times he only scored 8.5 fantasy points, one of the worst weeks for tight ends that we've seen all season long. So once again, it's all about risk and reward. Yeah, he's got 3 weeks where he absolutely put together huge games that you won, but what about all the rest of the weeks? Has he really been winning you any games? Probably not. So it really depends on your options at the tight end position right now. Obviously, if you don't have anybody and you would just be looking off the waiver wire, Taysom Hill is just going to be as risky as any of those guys. But if we have anybody with decent volume, they've got to go over Taysom Hill right now. And we'll see where Juwan Johnson goes. Not a bad week last week. We know they're banged up at the wide receiver position right now. We'll see if Juwan Johnson gets a team-high 7 targets once again. If he does, he could also be in for a good fantasy week, but he's more of like a low-end risk option for me, not really a whole lot of a safe floor just yet. There hasn't really been anything new with Kyle Pitts this year. Frustrating performances, maybe a little glimmer of hope every once in a while, and fantasy owners who are ripping their hair out trying to decide if they just toss him to waivers or if they really want to do that and potentially miss out on the big breakout that still has yet to come. Jonnu Smith has actually been a better tight end so far this year than what Kyle Pitts has been. And Jonnu Smith is coming off his 2nd week this season with 0 targets, which was crazy to think about because Desmond Ridder was back as the starter this week, and him and Jonnu Smith worked really well together at the beginning of the year. And the New Orleans Saints, who they played last week, no poster child for stopping tight ends. They're right in the middle of the road when it comes to doing that. So Jonnu Smith had an opportunity last week, and he didn't even get a target. Super crazy to think about. Played in over 60% of the snaps, however. So going this week, unfortunately, I can't trust either of these guys going up against that tough Jets defense. Probably going to make things really difficult on Desmond Ridder this week. And for Tyler Conklin, they had 4 tight ends taking snaps last week. So even though this is a good matchup, going up against an Atlanta Falcons defense that does allow the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position, it's really hard for me to try and bank on Tyler Conklin when 3 other tight ends may get targets as well. Arizona and Pittsburgh is going to bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. And with Christmas almost here, it doesn't matter if you need something to put under the tree or some awesome stocking stuffers. Head on over to manscaped.com and check out all of their new products available now. And when using code word headliners at checkout, you're going to get 20% off the entire order and free shipping. I made the joke last week about Trey McBride going back and forth between good performances and subpar performances. And that continued to hold true because he was a top 10 tight end, then not, then top 10, then not, then top 10, then not. Back to top 10 this past week, which means in this matchup, he would probably be outside the top 10 if we go by that study right there. And there's no scientific evidence to back that up. So what are we going to get from Trey McBride this week? Well, this is going to be a tough matchup. Well, both of these teams are inside the top 10 fewest points allowed to the tight end position. And for Trey McBride, it really is going to depend on the volume once again, because I don't see a bunch of big plays coming for him. But if we can put together enough chunk plays, it will definitely give him the volume to be inside the top 10 once again. And Pat Freiermuth is coming off a huge week, and you have to suspect that Kenny Pickett will be looking his way. Now, keep in mind, though, a lot of people are going to look at Arizona and see that Tyler Higbee scored twice against them last week and just automatically go to Pat Freiermuth blowing up and having a good game. Even with that game last week, Arizona still allows the 9th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. And they're still well inside the top 10 of fewest receiving yards allowed as well. So is Freiermuth going to have as big of a week as he did last week? Absolutely not. But the great thing about these two tight ends, even if their ceiling is a little bit lower this week, they're two of the main targets for their quarterbacks right now. And that could be just enough, given the state of the tight end position right now, for us to go ahead and throw them into our lineup, even if we don't have to worry about a huge week ahead. For Indianapolis and Tennessee, there's not going to be a whole lot to talk about here. Tennessee does a really good job of limiting tight end points, and Indianapolis doesn't really do a whole lot to even utilize the tight end themselves. So we'll be out on any tight end, even the leader in targets at the tight end position for Indy, Kylen Granson. And Chigiooko is coming off of his best week of the season, and it still wasn't nearly enough to get us super excited moving forward, but this could potentially be another good matchup for him. If Tennessee is serious about getting him involved the rest of the season, then absolutely he could become a fantasy starter at some point. But so far this season, we haven't seen one performance inside the top 12, so until I start to see it continue, there's no way I can even rely on it to start. We'll keep an eye on Logan Thomas in the Miami-Washington matchup, but quite honestly, I don't know what there is to keep an eye on. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he's not inside the top 12 at the position. That's just the way it is. Now, he has seen some decent games this season with decent target share. His best stretch of games over the last several weeks saw him anywhere from 40 to 55 receiving yards. But even with that work, he still was not cracking the top 12 if he was not scoring a touchdown. So Logan Thomas is essentially the tight end that you look towards every single week that you need to stream somebody, or you need to find someone, or you're in a panic mode because you had an injury, because we've seen him had some decent games in the past. And it seems like right when we forget about Logan Thomas is when he plays his best football. So I'm going to do you all a favor out there. If you've been trying to play Logan Thomas, I'm going to forget about him. And maybe this week will be the week that he has a good game and a negative game script against one of the NFL's best offenses. The matchup of Denver and Houston is going to bring the two defenses that allow the most fantasy points to the tight end position. Now, Adam Troutman is not going to be worth using. Yes, he scored last week, but even with the touchdown, it wasn't enough to get him inside the top 12 tight ends. He's been a top 12 tight end one time this year, and he's got plenty of games where he's received 0 targets. He's just not utilized. And even going up against Houston, I can't imagine he'll get a target or two this week. Even if he does, he's got to hope it's in the red zone and he scores a touchdown on it. But for Houston and Dalton Schultz, down the stretch here, these important games late in the season where we need to win to potentially grind into the playoffs, Dalton Schultz let us down the most. What an awful performance last week. And unfortunately, it was one where it left our teams in a really tough spot if we didn't have high upside everywhere else. Now, hopefully going up against the Denver Broncos, he can get back on track. Denver's defense has looked a whole lot better as of recent, but we know Houston's going to throw the ball, and we know CJ Stroud has been basically elite this year, it feels like, and that Dalton Schultz, when there's a lot of receivers being covered heavily the way that Nico Collins and Tank Dell might, Dalton Schultz could be the key difference in Houston getting back on track with a win, and Dalton Schultz having a huge fantasy day for those of us that may need it the most. Maybe it's possible we're finding some late season magic with Cade Otton here. And for weeks, you've been hearing me say that the guy plays over 90% of the snaps on offense. He plays more snaps than any other tight end in football right now. And it really has just flabbergasted me that Tampa hasn't truly made a commitment to get him more involved in the passing game. Well, over the last few weeks, he's looked a lot better. In 3 of his last 4 matchups, he does have over 45 receiving yards, including the last 2 weeks back to back. So are we going to continue moving forward with that? Because he's been a guy that's been either right inside the top 12 or fringe top 12 in 3 of the last 4 weeks. Going up against Carolina, it's a little bit of a tougher matchup in the secondary, but maybe Cade Otton is starting to move forward a little bit. Now, I'm not willing at this point to say that I'm waiting to trust him or anything like that, because just because it's 3 okay weeks, really propelled by a 2-touchdown game, isn't nearly enough for me to jump on board as of yet. So he's still going to be super risky. But if we get another good matchup this week, then maybe next week is when we say Cade Otton could be a guy that helps lead us into the playoffs and maybe even a championship. Me saying all this in this video is probably going to end up jinxing him, but it's got to be said. David Njoku may be one of the safest tight end options in football right now. He just completed his 6th straight week inside the top 12. How many other tight ends can we say that about currently? And his biggest thing during that time frame is targets, because during that stretch, he has at least 8 targets in every single game. And over the last 3 weeks, he has at least 9 targets in each game, including 15 2 weeks ago. So maybe he's not going to see double-digit targets every week, but it's very clear that David Njoku is making an impact in the passing game right now and being heavily utilized by the Browns offense, which is 100% needed given who they have right now at the quarterback position. So keep an eye on David Njoku the rest of the way. Maybe he doesn't have the upside that we would like, but hey, give me a top 12 tight end every single week, and I am more than willing to risk it with him the rest of the way. Now, Tyler Higbee had 2 touchdowns last week, and my hope is that a lot of you out there didn't run to waste a bunch of fab or waiver priority on him, because he really hasn't done a whole lot this season. Yeah, the 2 touchdowns are great, and it was against a defense that's done pretty well against tight ends so far this year. But now he gets the defense that's number 1 overall in the league and also allows the fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. I just don't see it from Tyler Higbee this week. Maybe he does get 5 or 6 targets this week, but I'm not seeing any touchdowns, and I'm certainly not seeing any type of performances willing to roll off of what we saw previously. A couple of weeks ago, I did an awful impression of Forrest Gump when I compared George Kittle to a box of chocolates. You just never know what you're going to get with him. And this past week on Thanksgiving, you were hoping for a little after dinner treat watching San Francisco and Seattle, and you wanted George Kittle to pop open that box of chocolates. You looked down and there was nothing in there, because that was one of the performances that George Kittle had this past week. He's got a super high ceiling, one of the most explosive tight ends in all of football, but there are going to be games where he just doesn't give you the performance that you need. If you're looking for safe tight ends, David Njoku, even though he doesn't have a high ceiling right now, is one of the safer tight ends that you could play over George Kittle. If you're running Kittle out there every single week, though, you just got to be ready for it. I mean, over the last 6 games, he was a top 8 tight end 5 times, and 4 of those times he was inside the top 3 tight ends. So we know the dude can absolutely ball out. But when it matters most in some tough matchups, George Kittle may end up disappearing for you. But this week against Philadelphia, a secondary that continues to get burned by big plays through the air, George Kittle could be back on track and inside the top 10 once again. After back-to-back weeks of not being inside the top 10 tight ends, Travis Kelce owners were starting to panic a little bit. And now that they're done with the bye and Travis Kelce is back and on the field and rolling the last couple of weeks, he's firmly back inside the top 10 once again. But there are some Travis Kelce owners out there right now that are struggling to be excited with him on a weekly basis. Even though he continues to be the best tight end in football, he continues to have more tight end 1 performances than any other tight end outside of TJ Hawkinson, and he's putting up consistent numbers. People are not happy because they spent a 1st or a 2nd round pick on him, and he's not proving to be the wide receiver 1 that a lot of people thought he would. And it's because he's not scoring a ton of touchdowns. But the reasons he's not scoring a ton of touchdowns is because the wide receiver core as a whole and the team as a whole just is super inconsistent. In fact, in the second half of games this year, it is well documented that Kansas City is struggling to find the end zone. So it's not a product of Patrick Mahomes, and it's not a product of Travis Kelce. It's a product of not having the consistent weapons around to help push the ball down the field and put them in a position to score more often. But it's Travis Kelce. If you drafted him, you're starting him every single week. Just don't be frustrated with it, because right now you have one of the very few tight ends that you can put into the tight end spot every single week and you're good to go. Now, you might be wondering why Tucker Kraft is not on the slide in place of Luke Musgrave. Well, I mean, he scored a touchdown last week, and that's great, and he didn't really do a whole lot outside of that, but now he's getting a Kansas City defense ranked inside the top 5, a fewest fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. So for me, I wouldn't have even been interested in playing him this week. But this is also a trap because I'm always interested to see how many people actually watch the segment instead of just look on the slide. So if you see anybody commenting about why I didn't include Tucker Kraft in this video, make sure you just reply with "gotcha" and we'll have a good time. Headliner Nation, I tried to will it into existence that Tanner Hudson was going to be an under the radar guy that we could grab to potentially help us out at the tight end position here towards the end of the season. And while he does lead the Cincinnati Bengals tight ends in targets over the last few weeks, they're still utilizing 3 tight ends with him, Drew Sample, and Irv Smith Jr. Now, Tanner Hudson, 5 targets last week, is kind of being utilized in between the 20s. When they're out in open space, Hudson seems to be on the field a little bit more, and then Drew Sample looks to be a guy that they're trying to utilize maybe in the red zone a little bit more often. So, unfortunately, because they're not leaving Tanner Hudson out there a little bit more, and Jake Browning really hasn't looked at him as much as I would have liked, he doesn't have the best floor in the world right now. If they were short 1 tight end and maybe we're only playing 2, I would say let's go for it again. But we're going to go ahead and go off of it this week and maybe just keep our fingers crossed that Tanner Hudson does become a thing. So we weren't entirely wrong. But there's one area that I'm not going to let you down, and I am willing this into existence for this week. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Evan Engram touchdown week. That's exactly what we are going for this week. Evan Engram, we've talked about him for the last few weeks as being a guy that if you play him in your lineup, he's not going to give you a lot of upside, but he's going to give you an okay floor. He's going to be like tight end 10 to 14 a majority of the time. But this past week, you could see Jacksonville trying to spring Evan Engram in the end zone to get him that touchdown. I'm willing to bet on Evan Engram having a really nice day and finding the end zone for the first time this season. All right, Headliner Nation, there you have it. A lot of teams on buys this week, and we are missing a few of those important tight ends that we have been starting so far this season. But moving forward, hopefully this video is able to help you out with making some decisions to at least get through week 13 before your starters come back. I'm going to get out of here though, Headliner Nation. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notifications. All of you stay safe and healthy as well, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.